The impossible war. The galaxy was vast and filled with countless civilizations, yet none of them had ever believed that humans would last long. When the great empire turned its eyes toward Earth, the empire had ruled for centuries, crushing any race that dared resist and bending worlds under its banners. When the Council of Stars gathered to watch the first clashes, they shook their heads and whispered that humanity would fall quickly, for humans were outnumbered 100 to 1. Their fleets were mighty but small compared to the endless armadas of the Empire, and their colonies were scattered across fragile frontiers. From the first moment of war, humans understood what they faced. Reports streamed into Earth of planets falling in days, orbital defenses crumbling, and cities burning beneath plasma fire. Entire colonies screamed for help as fleets of the Empire swept across the sky, blotting out the stars with their numbers. Humanity had always been stubborn, but even the most stubborn heart trembled when the reality of extinction drew near. Still, the admirals of Earth ordered their fleets into formation, not to wait behind walls but to fight in the open void where hope was thin yet courage remained. The darkness of space, the first great battles were fought. Human destroyers darted among enemy cruisers like wolves, striking at the flanks of beasts far larger than themselves. Carriers launched squadrons of fighters so small that the Empire at first dismissed them as annoyances. Yet each pilot fought with a fury that shocked alien commanders. In one system, 3 human frigates sacrificed themselves to ram an enemy battleship, tearing open its hull in a blaze that burned for hours. Across the galaxy, whispers spread that these strange creatures from Earth were not surrendering, but fighting to the last breath. But numbers told a cruel story. For every human victory, 3 losses followed. Worlds were abandoned when fleets could not arrive in time. The Empire advanced, steadily crushing resistance with the inevitability of a storm. Propaganda broadcasts declared that humanity was broken and would kneel before the Emperor's throne. The Galactic Council, who watched in secret chambers, told themselves that the humans could not last another season. They saw humanity as brave but foolish, for no one had ever stood against such odds and survived. On Earth, the mood was grim. Families huddled in shelters listening to news of distant cousins lost and cities erased. Soldiers boarded transports knowing they might never return. The planet itself began to prepare for siege, digging deep into mountains and oceans to hide what could not be moved. Yet even as despair spread, a strange determination grew among the people. They remembered old stories of standing alone against empires long before they had reached the stars, and they told themselves that if they must vanish, they would vanish fighting. Admiral Reyes, commanding the First Fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the tactical maps glowing before him. Red markers filled the chart like blood seeping across parchment. He knew his ships could not hold forever, yet his voice was calm when he ordered them forward. Better to die striking than to wait for the enemy to crush them in silence. Crews followed him without hesitation, for humanity had no room for fear now. They were outnumbered, but they were not outwilled. The first month of war turned into the second, and still humanity fought. The Empire grew irritated as their quick victory became a grinding struggle. They sent more ships, more soldiers, more firepower, determined to erase this stubborn species once and for all. In the shadow of stars, humanity's fleets grew smaller yet fiercer. Every loss was mourned, but every strike was remembered. The enemy began to respect the humans even as they sought to destroy them. And in the halls of the Council there were whispers of something unexpected. Not all species wished to see humanity destroyed. A few remembered debts owed to humans, small gestures in trade or protection that had once saved their worlds. Others saw in humanity's resistance a spark they thought long dead, the courage to fight when surrender seemed certain. Yet none dared speak openly, not yet, for to oppose the Empire was to invite ruin. For now humanity stood alone, outnumbered, surrounded, bleeding from every strike but unbroken. The galaxy waited for the final blow, believing that soon Earth itself would burn. Humanity knew the truth of their situation, but they refused to let fear rule them. This was the impossible war, the war they should never have been able to fight, yet fight it they did. And somewhere beyond the edge of known space, faint signals stirred, hinting that perhaps humanity was not as alone as the Empire believed. The enemy advances, the Empire pressed forward with the weight of a tidal wave that seemed unstoppable. After the first months of fighting, when they had expected quick triumph, their commanders adjusted strategies and deployed even larger fleets. Where once dozens of ships were sent, now hundreds arrived, blotting out starlight and filling every system with shadows of steel. Human colonies scattered across the frontier became targets for these armadas, and one by one they were assaulted with overwhelming force. Defenders fought bravely, but the outcome was rarely in doubt. Orbital bombardments reduced cities to glass, mining outposts were erased from the surface of moons, and proud settlements were left as smoldering ruins. The Empire delighted in broadcasting these victories. Across every channel their voices echoed with cruel certainty as they announced that humanity had been broken. Images of shattered colonies were spread through the galaxy as propaganda, portraying humans as reckless fools who should have surrendered at the first demand. The Galactic Council received these transmissions and debated behind closed doors, whispering that perhaps it was better for humanity to fall quickly before their resistance dragged others into disaster. To the Council, humanity was a nuisance, and to the Empire they were prey. But inside the hearts of humans something burned hotter with each defeat. Soldiers returned from battle scarred and weary, yet filled with rage at what they had seen. Families of the fallen cried but also swore vengeance. When the enemy destroyed one world, the survivors of that world begged to join the next fight. Humanity had no illusions of victory, yet the determination to resist grew deeper, as if each strike of the Empire's hand only tempered their spirit further. Admiral Reyes and the other fleet commanders drew plans that would delay the Empire's advance for every possible hour, even though they knew the cost would be paid in lives. In the Battle of Vega Prime, the Empire sent a fleet 10 times larger than the human defenders. Instead of waiting for annihilation, the humans launched a sudden counterattack. Small frigates darted among enemy formations, firing concentrated volleys at their supply ships, crippling logistics even as they were destroyed in return. For 3 days the system burned with fire, and though Vega Prime eventually fell, the delay allowed thousands of civilians to escape through hidden jump lanes. The Empire declared victory, but their commanders felt irritation gnaw at them. Each time the humans should have collapsed, they somehow endured a little longer. Yet still the tide was too great. The outer rim colonies were stripped away one after another. Trade routes were cut and supply lines strained to breaking. On Earth, the atmosphere grew heavy with dread as casualty lists lengthened by the hour. Entire fleets vanished in battles where the numbers had been hopeless from the start. Every family had lost someone. Every city mourned, and the idea of humanity's extinction crept closer with each passing week. Yet within that sorrow was defiance. The people of Earth refused to kneel even in grief. The enemy advanced closer to Seoul itself. Their commanders promised the Emperor that soon the human homeworld would be conquered, and its population enslaved or erased. They expected the humans to panic, but instead they found resistance growing sharper. Engineers built weapons in hidden facilities deep underground. Scientists pushed forward desperate experiments, some of which had been locked away for fear of their danger. Soldiers trained harder, preparing for the last stand that everyone knew was coming. Across the fleet, rumors spread of secret pacts and old alliances, whispers that humanity might not be fighting alone forever. But nothing had been proven and no help had yet arrived. The Galactic Council continued to watch silently. Some members secretly admired the humans, but none dared send aid. The Empire's grip was too strong and their spies were everywhere. Still, the council chambers buzzed with unease, for every message of human defiance sparked unrest among other species, who had long grown weary of imperial dominance. The Empire recognized this and moved even faster, determined to crush humanity before their courage could inspire rebellion elsewhere. As weeks turned into months, the war maps grew red with enemy conquests. It seemed inevitable that Earth would soon face siege. Yet within the darkness of this looming storm, humanity did not collapse. Fleets shattered still managed to regroup. Pilots shot down returned and new fighters, and commanders slain were replaced by others equally fierce. To the Empire, this was an irritation, a delay in their inevitable triumph. But to humanity it was proof that their spirit could not be broken. And so the enemy advanced, burning a path toward the cradle of mankind. Each victory for the Empire came at a cost greater than they had planned, and behind their triumphs a faint unease began to spread. For though they were outnumbered, though they were pressed on every side, humanity was not fighting like prey. They were fighting like predators cornered, and in the heart of every human burned the promise that they would not stand alone forever. The galaxy began to sense that something was shifting, though no one yet knew what allies might rise when the time of final judgment came. The last stand rumors. The stars above Earth grew tense as fleets retreated toward the inner systems. Every battle on the frontier had bought days or weeks of time, but the Empire pressed forward with endless strength. The admirals gathered in hidden chambers deep within the orbital stations of Mars and Luna, and there they spoke of plans that none wished to make. A last stand would be needed, one final gathering of all ships that remained to humanity, a wall of steel to hold before Sol itself. There were no illusions. If the Empire's armadas continued their march, there would be no tomorrow for Earth, no survivors, no history beyond what the enemy chose to carve into ash. Yet even with the weight of doom pressing on them, the humans did not surrender. Civilians were told in whispers to prepare for evacuation, but most knew there would be nowhere safe to flee. Families moved underground and built shelters beneath mountains and oceans. Children were taught how to hide in caverns carved by drills, while soldiers marched endlessly across training grounds above. Earth itself was transforming into a fortress, not because victory was expected, but because humanity refused to give the Empire an easy triumph. News spread from colony to colony that the final defense would take place around Sol, and though despair clung to every word, it also carried something strange. People were proud that humanity would face its end with courage. In the space between battles, rumors began to grow. Strange signals had been picked up on long-range receivers, signals not of the Empire but of unknown fleets watching from the dark edges of the galaxy. Some claimed they were remnants of forgotten allies. Others whispered of species who had once traded with Earth and still carried debts of honor. Pilots spoke of encounters with unidentified ships that vanished before being identified. Admirals dismissed these tales as illusions born of fear, but the rumors refused to fade. In the crowded markets of the surviving colonies, merchants traded more than food and fuel. They traded stories, old tales of humans who had defended weaker races against pirates, of scientists who had shared medicines freely with those in need, of fleets that had protected refugees when no other power dared intervene. Each story ended with the same question. Did those races still remember? Would they come? Most answered no, for no one wished to hope in vain. Yet in every corner the question still lingered. The Empire grew aware of these whispers. Their propaganda declared that humanity was truly alone, mocked the idea of allies, and displayed images of conquered worlds where no help had ever arrived. They wanted fear to smother the spark of faith, but they did not understand how deeply the human spirit clung to even the faintest possibility. For humanity had always been a species that survived by believing in tomorrow, even when today seemed impossible. Admiral Reyes studied the maps once more. His fleets were half what they had been at the start of the war, and yet every ship was prepared for sacrifice. His officers asked him quietly if there was any chance of aid. He answered with the truth that no message had been received, no alliance confirmed, and no fleets promised. Yet in his heart he carried a memory of promises made long ago when humanity first stepped into the wider galaxy. He remembered treaties signed not with the Council but with smaller peoples who had sworn they would never forget kindness shown. Whether those promises meant anything now he could not know. On Earth the government prepared its final broadcasts. Leaders spoke to the people not with empty words but with honesty. They admitted the enemy was coming. They admitted the cost would be terrible, but they promised that the humans would not kneel. The speeches carried across every channel and every colony, and even as tears fell, the people felt pride. If they were to vanish, they would vanish as fighters, not slaves. The Empire gathered its fleets at staging points not far from Sol. Millions of soldiers boarded transports. Weapons were prepared to scorch Earth to dust, and commanders boasted of their soon-to-be total victory. Yet behind their confidence, a small unease began to creep, for every human battle had taken longer than expected, and every colony had resisted harder than planned. Their emperor demanded speed, but the enemy they faced refused to die quickly. So the galaxy waited. The Council whispered in fear and curiosity. The Empire prepared for conquest, and humanity sharpened its blades for the last stand. And still the rumors grew louder. Faint warp signatures recorded in the dark beyond charts, signals that flickered with patterns too ordered to be natural. Some claimed they were nothing. Others claimed they were the first shadows of fleets preparing to move. Humanity did not know the truth, but deep inside their hearts the people prayed that they were not forgotten. In those nights, as Earth prepared, for siege children looked to the stars and asked if anyone out there would come. Parents held them close and answered with quiet voices that maybe someone would remember. The admirals tightened their ranks, soldiers readied their weapons, and the people of Earth waited for the storm. Humanity was cornered yet unbroken, facing doom yet still holding a spark of belief. For though they were outnumbered and the enemy drew ever closer, the whispers of possible allies carried through the void, and whispers can sometimes grow into thunder. The return of forgotten friends. The Empire's fleets crossed into the outer reaches of Sol system with confidence. Their commanders prepared speeches of triumph, while their soldiers sharpened blades and powered plasma rifles, certain that the conquest of Earth would mark the greatest victory in Imperial history. The skies of Neptune and Uranus filled with shadows of warships as the enemy pushed closer, step by step determined to break the last defense of mankind. On Earth, alarms rang across every continent and the final call to arms was sounded. Humanity's fleets pulled together for what was expected to be their last battle. Battered vessels brought from distant colonies, frigates patched with scavenged parts, cruisers running on half power, yet each crew ready to fight to the end. Admiral Reyes stood at the command deck of his flagship and looked out at the sea of enemy signatures appearing on the tactical map. He could feel the weight of his ancestors upon him, for they had faced impossible odds before on Earth itself, when armies had stood against invasions with nothing but courage and steel. Now their descendants faced a challenge even greater, for this was not one world at risk but the entire survival of humankind. The order went out to prepare the fleets for engagement. No one expected to survive, but every voice on every channel answered without hesitation. Then something happened that no one had dared to predict. As the enemy armadas advanced closer to Mars, a new set of signals appeared at the very edge of sensors. At first, human operators thought it was interference or perhaps another wave of Imperial ships. Yet the patterns were different, the warp signatures old but familiar. Officers stared in disbelief as hundreds of vessels emerged from the dark, ships bearing markings of species long thought too weak or too timid to challenge the Empire. Communications erupted as identification codes were confirmed. These were not enemies. They were allies. The first arrivals were the Vayari, a small aquatic race whose colonies had once been saved by human ships during a great disaster. Their fleets were not large, but their carriers unleashed swarms of advanced strike craft that dazzled the sensors of Imperial ships. Soon after came the rugged Grath, a people of mountain worlds who remembered how human engineers had taught them to build defenses against raiders. Their heavy cruisers joined the line with guns blazing. Then came others thought lost to fear, each bringing their own strength. The Council had refused to help, but individuals and nations beyond its halls had chosen differently. They had not forgotten kindness shown in times of weakness. On the bridge of the human flagship, silence fell as the reality became clear. Humanity was no longer alone. The rumors had been true. The faint signals had not been illusions. Across the stars, those who remembered debts and those who had admired the defiance of humans had gathered at last. Communications filled with voices in a dozen languages offering their loyalty. Admiral Reyes felt his throat tighten, but he gave the only order that mattered. Form ranks together. Fight as one. The Empire reeled in shock. Their commanders had believed humanity abandoned by all, and now they faced a coalition none had expected. Their scouts reported fleets arriving in growing numbers, strange formations combining human ferocity with alien ingenuity. For the first time, doubt entered the voices of the Empire's leaders. They had mocked the idea of allies, yet here they were, materializing in the void with banners raised against tyranny. The first clash came swiftly. Imperial cruisers attempted to break through, but were met by human frigates supported by Vayari strike wings. Missiles and plasma fire lit the darkness in storms of energy. Grath cruisers rammed enemy battleships, tearing open their hulls in detonations that echoed across the comms. More allies warped in behind them, adding fresh strength to the line. For every human vessel crippled, 2 new allied ships emerged to fill the gap. The balance was shifting before the Empire's eyes. On Earth, the broadcasts went live. Civilians watching from shelters and stations saw the impossible unfold on their screens. Humanity was no longer isolated. Across the galaxy, allies had answered the call not through treaties of politics, but through bonds of respect and gratitude. The fear that had gripped every heart gave way to hope, a hope fierce enough to bring tears and cheers alike. Children who had asked if anyone would come now pointed to the skies and shouted that someone had indeed remembered. Admiral Reyes and his officers coordinated the growing coalition. It was chaos at first as languages and strategies clashed, but quickly a rhythm formed. Humans fought with reckless courage while their allies provided cunning tactics and specialized technologies. Together they began to push back the Imperial advance, not in small skirmishes but in open battle. The enemy, who had once marched forward with arrogance, found themselves facing a wall of defiance that grew stronger with every passing hour. For the first time in the war, the Empire felt fear. Their commanders shouted orders, but their fleets hesitated. This was no longer a simple conquest. This was resistance turning into uprising. Humanity had been thought weak and alone, but now they stood at the heart of a storm of allies who had risen beside them. The impossible war was no longer only human. It had become something greater, a war of many against one. And in that moment the future shifted, the turning of the battle. The void around Mars blazed with fire as fleets clashed on a scale never before seen by human eyes. The Empire had thrown its full weight into the attack, believing they would crush a single desperate species, yet they now faced a coalition of worlds that had chosen to fight beside humanity. The first moments of battle were chaotic as dozens of languages filled the channels and tactics from different cultures collided. But soon the chaos became unity. Humanity had always been quick to adapt, and their commanders shifted strategies to integrate their new allies with breathtaking speed. Admiral Reyes stood at the center of this storm, guiding fleets into formations that mixed human ferocity with alien precision, creating patterns of attack the Empire had never encountered. Human destroyers wove in and out of enemy formations, drawing fire, while the Vayari strike wings darted between them like flashes of lightning. The Grath cruisers advanced in tight phalanxes, their heavy armor shrugging off barrages long enough for human missile boats to slip past and strike at vulnerable targets. Smaller species contributed in ways that startled even their own allies. One race used cloaking technology thought lost to history, allowing them to sneak behind the Empire's carriers and tear them apart from within. Another species deployed swarms of drones that blinded Imperial targeting systems, leaving human gunners free to fire with lethal accuracy. The Empire had expected to dominate through sheer numbers, but the combined force fighting against them began to shift the balance. Every time an Imperial battleship pressed forward, it was met by coordinated fire from multiple species. Every attempt to break the line was answered with counterattacks from directions the Empire had not considered. Slowly, the unstoppable tide began to falter. On Earth, the broadcast filled every screen. Families huddled in bunkers and shelters watched in awe as ships that bore no human design fought side by side with their own. Children pointed at the glowing displays as alien craft shielded human carriers, as human frigates defended Allied transports, as voices from distant worlds cried out in solidarity across the void. For the first time since the war began, the people of Earth dared to believe in more than survival. They believed in victory. The Empire responded with fury. Commanders ordered relentless assaults determined to overwhelm the coalition with brute force. Planet killers were brought forward, massive weapons designed to annihilate entire worlds with a single strike. Yet each time they moved into position, they were harried by waves of Allied fleets who would not allow them to fire. In one desperate moment, a human battleship rammed a planet killer at full speed, sacrificing itself to prevent Earth's annihilation. Instead of despair, the act ignited a storm of courage, allies roaring their defiance across every channel and throwing themselves into the fight with renewed strength. As hours turned into days, the Empire realized the battle was slipping from their grasp. Their endless confidence was eroded by the determination of their enemies. Casualty reports mounted and morale cracked. Ships that had once advanced without hesitation now hesitated. Commanders who had mocked humanity now questioned whether this war could truly be won. The Emperor's promises of quick conquest rang hollow, as the coalition proved that unity could stand against even the largest of empires. Admiral Reyes felt the moment arrive when defense turned to offense. He gave the order for the fleets to push forward, not to simply hold the line but to drive the enemy back. Human ships surged ahead with allies at their side, slamming into Imperial formations with relentless strikes. One by one, the Empire's battle groups began to fall apart. The impossible war had shifted. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival alone. They were leading a storm that could break the Empire itself. On the ground, civilians felt the change even though they were far from the battlefield. The fear that had gripped every city was replaced by determination. People rebuilt shelters not as tombs but as strongholds. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers willing to serve now that hope had returned. Across the galaxy, whispers spread that the Empire could bleed, and once the idea took root, it spread faster than fire in dry grass. Species who had once hidden in silence began to consider rebellion. The Empire's myth of invincibility was cracking, and humanity stood at the heart of the fracture. The battle raged on, but for the first time the Empire was no longer advancing. Humanity and their unexpected allies had turned the tide, and in the burning skies above Mars, the galaxy witnessed that even the smallest spark of resistance could ignite into a blaze strong enough to blind an empire. The war was far from over, but the future no longer looked like certain defeat. It looked like the beginning of something greater, the shattered empire. The Empire had ruled for centuries through fear and unchallenged strength. But in the burning skies above Mars, its aura of invincibility began to unravel. What had started as a campaign of domination against a single outnumbered species had grown into something the Imperial strategists had never foreseen. Humanity had not stood alone, and that simple truth shook the very foundations of Imperial command. Their admirals barked orders, their soldiers fought with discipline, but doubt spread through the ranks like cracks in glass. Reports flooded into the Imperial throne world of fleets destroyed, of weapons failing under the pressure of coordinated strikes, of allies rising where none had dared resist before. For the first time in living memory, the Empire tasted fear. Humanity did not waste the opportunity. Admiral Reyes and his coalition commanders pressed the advantage with relentless precision. Human frigates, once considered disposable, were now the spearheads of bold maneuvers. Darting through Imperial formations with deadly accuracy, the Veari unleashed their strike wings in perfect harmony with human fighters, weaving patterns of destruction that left enemy cruisers adrift in silence. The Grath charged into the thick of battle with their heavy hulls, tearing through Imperial lines with brute force and refusing to yield even when surrounded. Each allied species brought its own strength, and together they became a storm the Empire could not contain. The Empire tried to regroup, ordering retreat from Mars to form a stronger line at Jupiter, but the coalition pursued without mercy. No longer was humanity fighting only for survival. They were fighting to break the grip of tyranny that had strangled the stars for too long. Every victory rallied more support. Messages arrived from distant systems where species long enslaved by the Empire began to rise in revolt. Colonies that had once lived in silence sent out pleas for weapons, eager to join the cause. The Empire had thought to make an example of humanity, but instead they had created a spark that set the galaxy aflame. On Earth, the people watched the news feeds in disbelief. Where once they had feared annihilation, now they cheered reports of Imperial retreats. The names of fallen heroes were remembered with honor, and the names of new allies were spoken with gratitude. Children who had hidden in bunkers now dreamed of the stars, believing they might grow up in a galaxy no longer ruled by fear. Factories roared with production, building weapons and ships at a pace never before imagined, fueled not by desperation alone but by a vision of victory. The Empire responded with brutality. They launched counterstrikes against allied worlds, hoping to punish them into silence. But those worlds no longer trembled. Protected by human fleets and emboldened by shared sacrifice, they resisted with a fierceness the Empire could not comprehend. For generations, the Empire had relied on terror to keep its dominion intact, but terror no longer worked. The people of the galaxy had seen that even a small species from a distant death world could stand against overwhelming odds, and if humans could fight, then so could they. Admiral Reyes coordinated the next great offensive, driving deep into Imperial-held space. For the first time in the war, humanity and its allies were not defending but advancing. The coalition struck shipyards that had produced the Empire's endless fleets, crippling production lines that had once seemed eternal. They targeted communications relays, severing the Empire's ability to coordinate across vast distances. Each strike was precise, calculated, and devastating. The Empire's commanders, who had once mocked humanity, now found themselves scrambling to defend their own heartland. The Galactic Council, which had stood aside for so long, could no longer ignore what was happening. Debates raged in their chambers as members argued whether to intervene, fearing both the wrath of the Empire and the growing influence of humanity. In the end, many realized that the balance of power had already shifted beyond their control. Humanity and its allies had forged a coalition outside the Council's authority, a coalition bound not by treaties of convenience but by shared survival and respect. The Empire's emperor raged from his throne as reports grew worse each day. His fleets were scattered, his subjects restless, and his enemies multiplying. He demanded victories that his commanders could no longer deliver. Rumors spread through imperial ranks that their cause was doomed, that the galaxy itself was turning against them. Some soldiers deserted, others surrendered, and even among the high command whispers of rebellion took root. The machine of tyranny that had seemed unbreakable was cracking from within. For humanity the cost had been terrible, but the victories proved their sacrifices were not in vain. The shattered empire still held countless worlds and immense power, yet the myth of its invulnerability had been destroyed. Humanity had led the charge and the galaxy had followed. The war was not yet finished, but its outcome was no longer certain doom. The empire was bleeding, the coalition was rising, and in the hearts of all who fought there burned the realization that the future would no longer be shaped by fear. It would be shaped by those who dared to resist. The empire that had once ruled the stars with unquestioned authority now staggered like a wounded beast. Its fleets were scattered across burning frontiers, its generals divided by blame, and its emperor locked away in his palace demanding victories that never came. The coalition led by humanity pressed forward system by system with determination that refused to break. Battles that once had seemed hopeless now became stepping stones toward liberation. Humanity had begun this war fighting for survival alone, but now they fought for something greater. They fought to free the galaxy from the chains of tyranny. Admiral Reyes looked upon the tactical displays of his fleet with a sense of awe. Where once his maps had shown red markers of enemy dominance, now they were dotted with blue and green symbols of allied forces. Each represented not just ships but living proof that humanity was no longer isolated. The Vayari still sent their strike wings to cut through Imperial squadrons. The Grath cruisers still advanced like mountains of steel, and new allies continued to join the cause as word of victory spread. Every battle that ended in coalition triumph brought new friends and new voices swearing to resist the Empire. The tide had turned so completely that even the Galactic Council, once paralyzed by fear, began to quietly send aid. On Earth, the transformation was profound. Where once there had been whispers of extinction, now there was celebration and pride. Factories worked without rest, producing ships that would fly not just for defense but for liberation. Civilians volunteered in numbers that astonished the admirals, offering to serve in fleets, repair ships, or support the massive logistics needed to sustain the war. Children who had once been hidden underground during the sieges now studied the stars with excitement, dreaming of futures as explorers rather than refugees. Humanity had changed. The galaxy had changed with them. The Empire made one last desperate attempt to turn the war. They gathered what remained of their armadas around their throne world, calling every ship from every corner of their dominion. The Emperor declared that the final battle would crush the coalition once and for all, that the galaxy would remember the price of rebellion. But the coalition was ready. Humanity had not fought through years of blood to falter at the last step. The fleet surged forward in unity, species of every kind moving together under a single purpose. It was not just a human fleet that arrived at the Empire's gates, but a storm of allies bound by loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. The battle for the throne world raged longer than any before. Imperial defenses were immense, layers of fortifications built over centuries, but the coalition struck from every side. Human destroyers tore through weak points in the shields, alien strike wings disabled the superweapons, and massive allied cruisers broke the rings of defense that had once seemed eternal. On the surface, rebellions erupted as enslaved peoples rose against their masters, inspired by the sight of humanity's banners flying overhead. The empire that had crushed countless worlds now faced rebellion not just from without, but from within. At last, the Imperial fleet shattered. The Emperor's flagship fled into the depths of space, leaving his generals abandoned. Coalition ships poured into orbit over the throne world, not to annihilate it, but to liberate it. Humanity had learned through pain the value of allies, and they would not rebuild tyranny in place of the old. Instead, they proclaimed that the galaxy would no longer be ruled by fear. The war was over. The empire was broken. When Admiral Reyes returned to Earth, he was met not with the quiet mourning that had once defined his people, but with a roar of triumph. Cities that had once wept under threat of annihilation now celebrated in unity. The names of allies were spoken with gratitude and respect. Humanity was no longer an isolated species clinging to survival. They were leaders of a coalition that had rewritten the balance of power across the stars. The Galactic Council reluctantly acknowledged this new reality. Where once they had dismissed humanity as reckless, they now bowed to the undeniable truth that humans had done what no one else had dared. They had fought the impossible war and won. They had turned despair into unity. They had transformed scattered worlds into a movement that shattered an empire. The Council would never hold the same power again, for the galaxy had seen what courage and determination could achieve. In the years that followed, a new galactic order began to take shape. Worlds once enslaved by the Empire were freed and given voices of their own. Trade routes opened not under the shadow of imperial guns but under agreements of cooperation. Humanity remained at the center, not as conquerors but as equals among their allies. They remembered too clearly the cost of war to demand crowns or thrones. Instead, they offered guidance and leadership forged in sacrifice. And so the story that had begun with humanity standing alone against impossible odds ended with them surrounded not by enemies, but by friends. The galaxy looked to them not with mockery but with respect. Humanity had been thought outnumbered, thought doomed, thought destined to vanish, yet when their allies rose beside them, they had proved the Empire wrong. In the silence that followed victory, humanity stood proud, knowing they had changed history forever. A new galactic order. The ruins of the Empire's throne world drifted in silence. Its shattered fleet scattered across the void and its once proud banners burning in the light of dying stars. Where fear had once ruled, freedom now spread. Humanity stood at the center of this transformation not as conquerors, but as the heart that had united a galaxy. They had been called reckless, they had been called doomed, and they had been told they would never survive. Yet they endured, and their allies rose beside them until even the greatest empire in the stars could no longer hold its throne. Admiral Reyes returned to Earth as a soldier who had expected to die long before victory. His eyes had seen fleets fall, worlds burn, and friends perish. Yet they had also seen the impossible dream of unity come alive. On the surface of Earth, crowds filled the cities, their voices rising in celebration not for vengeance but for hope. Humanity had not only saved itself, it had inspired countless others to believe that oppression was not eternal. The voices of the Vayari, the Grath, and dozens of other peoples now mingled with human voices in one chorus of victory. The galaxy began to reshape itself in the aftermath. Where once the Empire had ruled through terror, councils of equals now gathered to forge a new path. Species who had been slaves walked free. Worlds long silenced spoke openly. And fleets that had fought in desperation now patrolled in defense of peace. Humanity's name was spoken with respect, not for dominance but for the courage to fight when no one else believed resistance possible. Children on distant worlds learned of the battles of Vega Prime, and Mars not as tragedies but as the sparks that ignited freedom. On Earth, families mourned their losses yet held their heads high, knowing the sacrifices had built something greater than survival. Statues rose not only for human heroes but for the allies who had stood beside them. Symbols of unity carved into stone and steel. The once desperate bunkers were emptied and turned into schools and halls of learning. The memory of despair remained, but it was no longer a weight of fear. It was a lesson of how close humanity had come to extinction and how powerful hope could be when shared. The emperor who had fled into exile was never seen again. His throne remained empty, a relic of an age that had ended. The Galactic Council, humbled and diminished, sought to join the new order, but it was humanity and its allies who guided the future. They did so not with crowns or chains, but with the understanding that freedom must be defended by all. For none could stand alone forever. Admiral Reyes, standing on the deck of his flagship, gazed into the endless stars. Where once they had seemed filled with enemies, now they seemed filled with possibility. Humanity had been tested by fire, tempered by sacrifice, and strengthened by the bonds of friendship. They had been thought outnumbered and destined to fall, but the galaxy had witnessed what happened when allies answered the call. And so the war ended not with the triumph of a single species, but with the birth of a coalition bound by courage and trust. Humanity had begun as prey in the eyes of the Empire, But they had risen as leaders who inspired others to rise. The galaxy would never again be ruled by fear, for the people had learned that even the mightiest tyrant could be broken when the oppressed stood together. Humanity had lit that fire, and in its light a new order was born. The end.